Hello, my name is Daniel Adibi, and I will be your host for Our World 101, the show in which we explain complicated, real-world events and issues to bridge people together. Today's topic is about the Black Lives Matter movement. Briefly, the Black Lives Matter movement started in 2013 after the killing of an innocent 17-year-old student, Trayvon Martin. After the acquittal of the murderer, George Zimmerman, people around the world started to speak out against systemic racism. They are protesting police brutality and all racially motivated violence, although there was a deeper meaning of over 400 years of oppression. Here to talk to us today about these topics is Jackson Overton Clark, a current student at the University of Chicago and former student at the Haverford School. Jackson has worked tirelessly to promote racial understanding and to uncover racial biases in his community. He has created an amazing documentary entitled Black at Haverford, Conversations Not Had, which is eye-opening because it shows firsthand accounts of racism in our own backyard. Thank you so much for being on the show, Jackson, and we're really excited to have you here.
Glad to be here. Glad to be here.
So to start off, can you tell us a little bit about your documentary?
Yeah, so essentially, what my documentary kind of found its roots, and well, for the first fact, I was at Haverford since I was 4 years old, so that was kind of all I knew. That was the community I grew up in, kind of shaped who I am now in a lot of ways. And once I got to my senior year, I had to think about kind of what was I leaving behind, what was going to be my legacy at Haverford, what were people going to remember me by. And in my junior and senior years, not that it hadn't been a problem up until then, but especially my junior and senior years, I'd seen a lot more racially motivated incidents, a lot of racial tension, especially after the 2016 election, especially. There was definitely a change in that, especially. There were way more conversations that were racially motivated. There were incidents of there were the N-word. There were books that were burned by Black authors. There was just a lot of hostility. And at the same time, there was the backdrop, I think, over more of the mainline of this idea that we're so farther as a nation in terms of like getting rid of racism, or this idea of being a post-racial society than we actually are. And even within the school, a lot of administrators would be like, but you believe that we're much better, we're much further than we were 10, 20, 30 years ago. And I would always say, yes, in some ways, and no, in a lot of other ways. And so an independent research project that was honestly just supposed to be a history of the first Black student to go to Haverford, George Porgy Smith, who graduated in 1967, it ended up being a history from George all the way to the present to show kind of what's changed, what hasn't changed, and what we need to do. And that's kind of what inspired me to make it. It was more kind of a necessity at a certain point.
Yeah, I just wanted to say again, your documentary was amazing and very eye-opening. It shows how much racism is in our own backyard. And a lot of times we think we're a lot further in terms of justice than we really are. And that it's kind of like a catalyst to help to promote racism, if you know what I mean. So obviously your goal to promote social and racial justice is inspiring. Who was a role model to you growing up, and how did your passion for this evolve?
Well, I'll go two routes. I'll do people that I actually know and people that I looked up to in terms of, I guess, like celebrity, however you want to look at it. Obviously, you grow up learning about Martin Luther King, Malcolm X. As I got older, I started learning about the Black Panthers and kind of the bad light that was shown on them, and kind of coming to realize that what they were trying to do and kind of how they were portrayed did not match up. So obviously once I got to high school and I had to do a term paper in my history class about the Black Panthers, I kind of got inspired by them. Personally, I got role models for me growing up from my parents. Honestly, going to a predominantly white school, they wanted to make sure that I was still proud of being Black and I didn't lose sight of that. And so kind of my passion for it was more out of a necessity. Being a Black student at a predominantly white school, it wasn't like, ooh, let me just let's promote racial justice. Let's do this. It's kind of, as a Black student, as a Black kid in this country, it was like I kind of had to. I feel like my parents kind of empowered me and were a great support system, so I kind of lead the charge. I mean, understand not everybody is going to take on a documentary in the way that I did, but I would have to say, honestly, my parents kind of just had my back through it all, and they were just kind of seeing how they lead their own lives. Just kind of inspired me to follow this passion.
To start off, I wanted to talk a little bit about current events. So for our viewers, can you give context to the Black Lives Matter movement? What does the movement mean to you and to other Black people?
Exactly what's in the name, Black Lives Matter. I think what too many people, too much of what I hear is like, oh, but what about other people's lives? Black Lives Matter does not say other people's lives don't matter. It's just acknowledging in a country, which you mentioned in the intro, over 400 years of oppression towards a certain people, it's reminding this country that we matter. In one way, it can be looked at as Black Lives Matter as well, but you shouldn't need to be able to say that to know that we're saying that we're the only people that matter. And that's honestly what it means. It's honestly just showing that we matter. I know I had conversations back at Haverford where people were kind of confused or kind of annoyed by this whole idea of Black Lives Matter, when really it's just trying to show that we matter just as much as everybody else. And in this country, we haven't for so long, and it's just a reminder that we do.
Yeah, and racism towards the Black community, it's a predominant problem. So by saying Black Lives Matter, we're just saying we need to acknowledge that and we need to end it. And then All Lives Matter is even a little bit offensive because you're trying to take away the focus of ending racism.
That's exactly right. I think it's kind of one of those things where it's like, of course, all lives matter, but someone used to use this analogy where it was like, if one house is on fire and so all the attention is going to be on that one house that's on fire, people are going to put the firefighters and all this stuff and going to focus on this house, and the house next to it, they're going to be like, what about my house? Don't I deserve that attention? Don't I deserve the water? Don't I deserve that? It's like, yeah, your house isn't on fire. So you don't need that attention right now. So there's a lot of different analogies like that, but that's just one that I had heard pretty recently about Black Lives Matter that I like to share.
Yeah, you need to focus on what needs attention.
Yeah.
What goals would you like to see achieved through Black Lives Matter?
Honestly, it would just be, well, obviously there's an end to police brutality. I know we'll talk about that a little later, but I also just education. I'm such a huge advocate for just the education of people, because a lot of people are just ignorant. And I realize that a lot of people would actually be for Black Lives Matter if they just kind of educate themselves about what it's really about. I would hope that, obviously we'd hope that like certain legislation would get passed. But yeah, I think one thing is that the Black Lives Matter movement has done, at least this past summer, has done pretty well about doing, is just kind of bringing people together and getting people, and especially I think because we were in the times of COVID where everyone was kind of glued to their screen, everyone was following kind of what was going on in that way, that a lot accountability became a huge thing. Justice became a huge topic. I think, at least for me, when I was in middle school and Trayvon Martin happened and Michael Brown happened and Eric Gardner happened and just the list goes on, not as many people paid attention to it. So as soon as they saw Ferguson and they saw the riots going on in the streets, they saw that, did not acknowledge Michael Brown's body laying dead in the street for hours on end for the community to see. And I think this time around with Ahmaud Arbery, George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, things like that, everyone was paying attention, everyone was educating themselves. I hope that we can continue to do that with this movement.
Yeah, I think that's the amazing thing about the Black Lives Matter movement. It's bringing everybody now. Everybody is talking about justice and everybody is raising their voice. So you talked about, how you want the goals of education, new legislation, and the ending of police brutality. How do you foresee that happening, and what are some steps that we as individuals have to take?
In terms of education, I'll start with that one. Education is just, I find a lot of times people are like, okay, I think it's kind of taking the initiative to go educate yourself. Google is free. Everyone can figure out things. I think some people in a place of privilege feel like that it's the responsibility of somebody who's lived those experiences to lead them in the right direction or to educate them so they kind of just stay content with not knowing anything until someone teaches them. And sure, if you're around a Black person, you're around a person of color and they feel comfortable and willing to share their experience with you, listen. But it's not their responsibility to do so. It's going on Google. Maybe it's asking like, where should I start? But then after that, you have to take that initiative to truly figure out kind of like the history that goes into a bunch of these oppressive institutions that we kind of become accustomed to. In terms of police brutality, I think obviously a big topic of right now is the idea of defunding the police. And I know we're going to talk a bit about that later as well. But I think in terms of education, one of those things is going back and realizing where the modern form of policing that we have now, we got to figure out, we have to learn where policing finds its roots. And hint, it finds its roots in slave patrols. I'm actually taking a class right now where this is the exact topic we're talking about. But if you trace back, you kind of understand this history and how slavery and policing and all these other things are really intertwined, and why there are a lot of people who agree that within this current form of policing, this current institution, you won't see this kind of equity, this equality in terms of how people are policed, that everyone sees that'll happen. One thing that I hear a lot and I tend to agree with is that the system isn't exactly broken. It's kind of doing what it was made to do. And if you look into the history of what policing was initially supposed to be, it's kind of doing that same thing, just in different forms. Like obviously slavery in the form that we know it is no longer existing, but you still have policing, those same practices still being used in different, more covert forms today. So it's really just that education piece that people usually don't. They like to be willfully ignorant, and in that way, if you're ignorant and you don't know the history, then it's really easy to be like, how dare you say you want to get rid of the police, or how dare you want to like take money away from them, and all those other so things like that. I think with some little bit of education, I think at least we can at least get on the same page on some things. And I know there are people who will disagree, but I definitely think it definitely takes time, but I definitely think that's the first step.
Yeah, and the only way to end racism is for white people to go and educate themselves on different perspectives. For example, the police. Someone might be raised to think that the police will protect them, but another person might be raised to have the mindset that police might terrorize them or harm them. And you also need to educate yourself on history to see all of the racist history in this country.
Agreed.
So let's talk. Oh, sorry. Were you saying something? Okay. So let's talk about a controversial topic, the toppling of the Confederate statues. So statues from Robert E. Lee to even George Washington have been toppled recently. What are your thoughts on that?
Obviously, we know what the Confederacy stood for. there shouldn't be any statues. That's first and foremost. They're like toppling of the statues is the right thing to do, but it's also not enough. And I think there's a lot of people who see the toppling of the statue and they're like, okay, cool, check off that box. We don't need to do anything else. Because at the end of the day, it's symbolism and it won't do anything concrete. Getting rid of a statue isn't going to solve any of these problems that we've talked about, but it's definitely those reminders should not be there. Those statues, those figures should not be honored based on what the Confederacy stood for. So I definitely agree with like they should be gone and they shouldn't be there and they shouldn't be praised, but also we can't stop there.
Yeah, I actually have a different opinion on that. I think that we should keep the statues and we obviously shouldn't honor them. That's just a fact. They're Confederate, they're pro-slavery, they are, the instigators of racism. But I think that instead of running away from history, we should face it. So we could probably attach a message to the statue saying we're not honoring it, but we should definitely face our history and learn from our mistakes. But we should not honor the statues.
In that case, there's a lot more history that people need to address and face because there will be people who honor those statues and will say that it's my heritage, it's this, and that, will completely ignore the other side of history. And I think that would be my one thing is that people are very selective with the history that they tend to honor and they tend to remember. And that's kind of the whole idea of being willfully ignorant. So in that case, if we were to keep them and do kind of what you said, there's a lot more history that also needs to be acknowledged and kind of met head on. I think a lot of people in this country kind of obviously there are people in this country who are very patriotic from everything from like the American Revolution all the way down to like 9/11 or something like that, where it's just like very patriotic. And obviously it's like acknowledge those things. But you have to look on the other side for like the American Revolution. Let's talk about the slavery that was going on at the same time. Let's talk about the other history that we're trying to sweep under the rug. So if we were to do kind of that thing that you said, we would also need to acknowledge a lot more. And it would be interesting to see if people would be willing to do both.
Yeah. And I think this is a very controversial topic, as we've just seen. A lot of people have different views on it, but I think everybody can agree that we should not honor them.
Yes.
So you must feel upset about all the recent police brutality after George Floyd and now Daunte Wright. The list goes on. But it was a relief for so many to see Derek Chauvin charged with a guilty verdict. He was held accountable for his unforgivable act. How did the verdict make you feel?
Well, first of all, police brutality in this country has just been, it's only recently been on camera, but it's always been happening in many different forms. And it's kind of weird because growing up in this country, just seeing that, I've gotten used to it, which is a scary thing to say, that starting with at least for me in my generation, starting with Trayvon Martin, I just kind of got used to the fact that a police officer can look at me and see a criminal while I'm just living my life and I have to be on my toes about it all the time. So I think that's that. But also the verdict, it was very interesting. I was sitting in this exact spot when I found out the verdict and I didn't know how to act. I felt like I needed to cry, but I couldn't. I just felt numb because the scary thing is I was as equally sure that they were going to give a not guilty verdict as a guilty verdict, because based on this country's history, Derek Chauvin is at least a high-profile cases, is basically the first time that the guilty verdict has been given, and it's kind of scary. It's like a lot of people in my circles, we're expecting it to go not guilty, even though we saw it. We saw the murder. We saw it because there have been certain times where we've seen the murder on camera and they've given not guilty, or they've just given paid leave to the officer or something like that. And I think, so it just made me feel, I didn't know how to feel because it was like the right thing happened, but at the same time, this is the first time that happened. And the fact that I was so sure at a certain point that it wasn't going to happen says something. Because there was a lot of people who didn't think that it was going to go the right way.
Yeah, and the verdict shows that we are making a lot of progress in how we're finally acknowledging police brutality, but it also shows how much further we have to go because so many people were expecting a not guilty verdict, and that's wrong because he murdered George Floyd, and he should be held accountable for what he did.
Mm-hmm.
So going off of that, do you agree with defunding the police? Do you think it will be helpful, and what does it mean to you?
See, so now a lot of my work on Chicago, just in general, has definitely worked around this idea of defunding the police. And I want to start off by saying I understand why people, just the term itself, everybody is a very polarizing term in itself. And people immediately get scared and like, how could we do this? How could we? And essentially, what is at the heart of defunding the police is divesting from these billion-dollar police budgets and investing it in community programs, investing in mental health services, social services, so that there wouldn't even need to be police interaction with a lot of communities. Essentially, what that means is mental health professionals. If there's more mental health professionals, the interaction between people who have mental illnesses and the police wouldn't need to happen as much. If there are alternatives to the police when someone, for example, a lot of people who are suffering from drug abuse or from homelessness or experiencing homelessness often interact with police. If some of that money was given to housing initiatives so that people can get off the streets, find jobs, make a life for themselves, then there wouldn't need to be that police interaction. So I think this idea of divesting from these big budgets and investing in these other services, it truly minimizes the need for police in a lot of situations. And obviously people can talk about like, what about murderers? What about like serial killers? What about things like that? And obviously there's a lot of debate around that, but funding the people who are even abolitionists understand that we're not going to go and just like that get rid of police and then not have anything in its place. But defunding the police in itself isn't getting rid of the police entirely, at least not immediately. It's slowly lowering the need from them by kind of giving this police role, which police have been kind of charged with being like mental health professionals, being like security guards, being all these other things that they shouldn't be tasked to be, and giving it to the professionals that are actually have thousands of hours of training and doing certain things. But it's just these places are underfunded. Another thing a lot of people talk about is like cops in schools, right? At least at the beginning of this year, Chicago Public Schools had a $33 million contract with the Chicago Police Department. And I can just think about how much better these schools could be, how much less the dropout rate would be, how much if these schools could have full funded school counselors, nurses, updated textbooks, all these other things that us as mainline kids, we were privileged enough to have. And people are like, well, what if we take cops out of schools? What's going to happen? We never had cops at schools. We on the main line, might have had a public safety officer, but we didn't have cops in schools. I think it's just kind of showing this discrepancy between some schools that have cops and not. It's like, it's very much possible to defund the police in that way because there's already example with our schools, Haverford, with Episcopal, like stuff like that. It's possible, we just don't sometimes it's hard for me to be like, why can't people just see this clear difference? And if we start taking the money away and giving it and helping these schools become better, these communities become better funded in the way that our communities were so privileged to be, then we wouldn't even need the police in those situations in the first place. So I think that's kind of what I do understand why people are like scared of the whole topic and conversation.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think that it will be beneficial because police officers, as you said, are not trained to handle all situations. If someone's having a mental health breakdown, a psychologist should be there to help them. A lot of times, police don't know how to interact with someone who's having a mental health breakdown or how to handle that situation. And a lot of times that results in a lot of violence. And I think that could be avoided if there were other people other than police officers and if the money was reallocated. And I also want to say I have a lot of respect for police officers and the dangers they go through. I mean, they're risking their lives every day. But I do think that it would be beneficial if we had other trained professionals to help. So the next topic is the reparation bills. So they're being decided right now in the House of Representatives, and they aim to give trillions of dollars to African-American families who were adversely affected by racist policies in the United States. What's your opinion on it? Do you think it will help?
Short answer, yes, but it's a very tricky situation to talk about. I know it takes a long time to figure out, like, are we going to give money out the same way we gave out stimulus checks? And in that case, because of just the discrepancies in access to resources and things like that that built up over the 400 years of kind of even Black people being in this country, it's if you give somebody money, are they going to know the best way to spend it? Are they like, how much do you give? How much do you give to each family? Do you give to each person? Is it better to just invest it in communities? There's so many different questions. It's like, how do you even quantify the oppression and the trauma that was caused by these racist policies? It's like, if you can search up a bunch of different articles of people trying to like quantify something that's really hard to be quantified. So it's kind of hard. Like, I definitely think that there needs to be some form of reparations. It's really hard to figure out exactly how that would best work.
Yeah, it's really hard to figure out how you're going to give it. You have to give instructions for how to use it. If you're going to give it to communities instead of individuals, and also to figure out how far back we go. Are we going back 400 years, 20 years?
Exactly.
Yeah. Well, we've had a great discussion. We talked about the Black Lives Matter protests and some currently debated topics, the toppling of Confederate statues, defunding the police, and reparations. Jackson, thank you so much for being on the show.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, it was a great experience. To all of our viewers, thank you so much for watching, and I hope you join us again for our next episode, where Jackson will be back to talk about his experiences with racism at his school. I'm Daniel Adibi, and I'll see you soon.